Good morning, class. Happy Monday. It's been about 1 month since quarantine started. It's been a while since I've had a chance to get my hair cut, so here we are. In any case, I'm sure everyone else is in the same boat. So this is going to be the first video of two this week because there's two different readings that are related but also very different. So I'm going to talk about the first reading, which is the Transnational Turn in Ecocinema. So you may have noticed that this portion of the class, these 4 weeks, all the films we're watching are not U.S. productions. Princess Mononoke is Japanese, Okja is South Korean, also but a co-production with Netflix. Tambien La Lluvia is Spanish and Bolivian production. And then When Two Worlds Collide is South American U.S. production. In any case, I want to talk about the importance of looking at ecocinema from a transnational point of view. To do that, we need to define and explain what transnational approaches to ecocinema are. So I'm basically going to go through the chapter from the book I assigned you by Pietra Kappa. So on a very basic level, transnational cinema is what we used to call world cinema. That is, films produced outside the United States. So these are perspectives that are beyond Hollywood, beyond the Western point of view. All the film posters that I've included here are mentioned in the chapter, so I just thought I would reference those. You can see they're from countries all over the world, including Italy. The transnational perspective. So the question is, how can ecocinema expand to take into consideration broader international concerns? This is important. We want to go beyond the Hollywood point of view of the environment, which we're going to problematize in a minute. So a rhetorical question related to this is, how do ideas in cinema circulate through different cultures and different realities? So the chapter goes through a fairly extensive critique of what he calls the ecological panoptic, or green busters, big environmental blockbuster films. Here I mentioned just 2012, Day After Tomorrow, and Wall-E as a couple examples. And what he argues is that even though that these films have ecological concerns, they still normalize the status quo. They normalize certain geopolitical frameworks. 2012, I don't know if you saw that, in particular reinforces sort of Western hegemonic power and sort of centers and normalizes the United States as sort of a good hegemon in the center. I mean, even The Day After Tomorrow, which criticizes American politics, it still centers the American point of view as the most important point of view. And these assumptions are largely unexamined, and they are assumed. You might notice that this is somewhat similar to the discussion about white privilege, that, white privilege is sort of everywhere, but it's not anything that's ever exactly examined or explored. It's just assumed to be the norm. In any case, these types of blockbuster Hollywood films don't fundamentally challenge the power and hegemony that's at the source of ecological problems. And if you think about it, this makes sense. I mean, what is Hollywood? But essentially, Hollywood studios are financial institutions that fund artistic projects, and they only, they invest millions and millions of dollars. Films are expensive to make, with the goal, of course, to make money. So another critique is that the world is flattened through globalization. So this idea that was popularized about globalization in the past 30 years was that it would equalize everybody. But to what, this idea of like the developed world, what is the developing world developing into? To be like us? So that flattens the world. Now, some would celebrate that as great. Everyone can have the same opportunities. But others would argue that that reinforces sort of a ethnocentric point of view, that everyone should be like a white, Western, European, American, North American type of culture, democracy, society. And, that ignores the kind of diversity of the world and different sort of multicultural perspectives. These films are anthropocentric. They colonize the environment for human consumption, so they are primarily there for our entertainment. They are cathartic. They're feel-bad cinema. They acknowledge that these problems exist, but they just turn these problems into catharsis that, we can go to the film, it contains the crisis, we can have our fun, go home and continue our environmentally destructive lifestyles without changing our behaviors. These films also have a tendency to stereotype and generalize about others, and these films are made for a Western audience. These films are not made for South American, Chinese, African, Middle Eastern audiences. They're made for Americans and Europeans, even though they are in a global marketplace. So, in many ways, these films often have an Orientalist gaze. So, I don't have time to get into some specific examples here, but quite typically, countries outside the U.S. and Europe are always shown as underdeveloped, as poor, as sources of chaos, and so forth. Okay, so here we have a still from Even the Rain, which we'll watch next week, and then When Two Worlds Collide, that we'll watch in 2 weeks. Transnational Studies focuses on texts that centralize the theme of global discontent and inequality. So, according to Kappa, at least, when he talks about transnational cinema, these types of films undermine this hegemony, that they bring in new perspectives that challenge this dominant point of view. Transnational concerns include, and some of these we already talked about when we talked about postmodernism, hybridity, postcolonialism, diaspora, the geopolitics of economics of global inequality, especially colonial power and human centricism. So we're going to get more into colonialism in the next 2 weeks. I'm not going to focus so much today because I'm going to do a whole lecture on post-colonialism for our discussion of Even the Rain. But suffice to say that, at least according to Kappa's framework, transnational films pose these kind of questions. They challenge, the Western globalized hegemony. Transnational cinema communicates at the world level, which harks to the concept of eco-cosmopolitanism, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So, for example, a film like Planet Earth, which is about Earth, so theoretically it's about the whole world, but that film is not made for the whole world. It's made for a British audience or an American audience, and so therefore it's not bringing in the concerns of people that are outside of this purview. Eco-cosmopolitanism comes from the great writer Ursula Heiss, and I put 2 posters here because these films were talked about extensively in the chapter Enter the Void and The Limits of Control. I invite you to watch those on your own if you feel up to it. Talks about that, that there's a local reality that shows us a very particular sense of place. So all the films we're watching these coming weeks, these transnational cinema films, have a very strong sense of place. They have local identities that they're showing us. But quite often there's a dichotomy of local versus global. And what Heist argues about is that you have a strong local identity, but you contextualize that in global problems, in planetary problems. So she argues very strongly to have the strong local identity, but also in the context of an imagined planetary community that's not isolated, but it's interconnected to a larger planetary reality. So it's kind of like multiculturalism, where you assume that there's diversity, you have different points of view, you respect people's different cultural perspectives, but we also at the same time have to live together and find a way to manage with each other. So this is the opposite of sort of the rhetoric of globalization of the past 30 years, where the idea is to unflatten the world, to make the world, put it into relief, give it more depth, more diversity. Okay, so Kappa uses this very wonderful quote. This is coming from 2 Chinese theorists, and their definition of ecocinema, you'll notice, is quite different than the authors we talked about at the beginning of the semester, who are more from the Western tradition. So let's just go ahead and read this. The study of the production and reproduction of life, the relationship between human body and the ecosystem, and the controlling and administering of the human body in modern capitalist and social regimes is what constitutes ecocinema. So what this is alluding to is biopolitics, which we'll talk about next week in more depth, but biopolitics is essentially the power over life and death. And so this is a much more expansive definition of ecocinema, where even if a film is not explicitly about the environment, if the film is about the capitalist system controlling the body, according to this definition, that is a form of ecocinema, because the body is an ecosystem. It's part of an ecosystem. We're animals, we're humans, we're creatures in this environment. So this is a much more expansive idea. So Dirty Pretty Things, The Constant Gardener, and Get Out are all examples of films about this, the system trying to control people, trying to control people's bodies. And if you haven't seen any of these films, I highly recommend them. Okay, so the last slide for this portion of today's lecture. Let me move this. Actually, let me just take this out. So I'm going to read to you this quote here. It's, I think, sums up quite nicely. It's talking about Chinese ecocinema, but I think it's a good discussion that we can relate to the whole topic of transnational ecocinema. So, no narrative, closure, or catharsis. So what we're talking about here is these non-Hollywood films. They have no narrative, they have no closure, no catharsis, no gesture towards the promise of less disruptive and more locally engaged, ecologically friendly, and sustainable development politics. Instead, the traumatizing exigencies of national development are shown to be woven into the very fabric of everyday life, creating irresolvable intra- and interpersonal conflict, anomie, sexual dysphoria, dislocation, loss, etc., in projecting the character's confusion and disorientation into the viewing audience. A work of art can make original and complex contributions towards our understanding of the conflicted state of human agency under conditions of ecological devastation in China today. The unquestionable good of economic progress and modernization is shown to be the cause of irreversible ecological damage and obliteration of historically rich local communities. So I'll just leave it at that for this portion of the lecture. I think this is a good description of how transnational ecocinema is quite different than the sort of classic Hollywood approach, where everything is tied up in a nice little bow and you have a resolution at the end of the story, and the status quo prevails at the very end. The balance was turned upside down but restored, etc. Okay, so let's stop there. I'm going to go to the next talk will be specifically about animals and oak jump. Okay, see you shortly.